We're going to talk about terminology management for Indigenous languages. And the first thing that I have to establish is the difference between terminology management and lexicography. We're all linguists one way or another, and we're well familiar with dictionaries. But our dictionaries are mostly lexicographical, and that's not a bad thing. It's just different. What's the difference between a model for a lexicographical entry and a terminological entry? In fact, one of us in this group once said to me, why bother with terminology? It's so complicated. Let's stick with lexicography. Everybody understands that. Well, lexicography is actually potentially the more difficult way to do things. A lexicographical entry, and we're going to use the word tree. I think that's a concept most of us understand. Not universally understandable, but most of us understand it. A lexicographical entry for the word tree will document all the different meanings of the word tree and what that looks like. And this actually is not a complete list of all the possible meanings. These are just ones that I grabbed to put on this slide. There are 8 of them here, and I'm not going to read through them all. You can kind of get the idea. The word tree is used, as many, many words are used, to form metaphoric references to all sorts of objects in the real world that remind us of trees. In contrast to the list of meanings that are associated with the word tree, a terminological entry focuses on just one of these concepts. Now, that doesn't mean that we can only define one. There would be 8 separate entries for these, and there could be links among them. So the terminological entry will list the concept and define it. Often the definition is at the very top of the entry, so you know what you're talking about. The subject field will be there. And you can have all the synonyms. As it turns out, there are very few synonyms to the word tree. But if we look at a collection of languages, and here you see the languages that I either read or sort of read, and you have, I have 6 here in this set, but we could have 40 that we need in localization environments, for instance. 40 different equivalents in the same entry. This may not look like it's relevant to our indigenous languages, but actually, in reality, it probably is. Most of our indigenous languages exist one way or another inside an environment that is governed by some hegemonous language, like English, Spanish, French, Chinese, Russian, where the indigenous language is encapsulated in a larger cultural environment and linguistic environment. Many of the researchers who are going to conduct this research, whether they are members of the indigenous group themselves or people who have been trained as anthropological linguists, will be using that hegemonous language in their documentation and establishing the relationships between the indigenous language and the hegemonous language, either for the benefit of the indigenous language speakers, perhaps they want to deliver medical information, for instance, or for the benefit of research in general. So let's look at a terminological entry, and this is just the bare bones of a terminological entry. For our tree, we need to know the subject matter right off. If we say it's botany, we're not building a house. We're not looking at crystallography. We're not in some sort of Christian metaphor. It's botany. And the definition, oh no, there it goes. The definition, my mouse was slow. The definition here is very simple. We could have a much more complex definition. My daughter, who is a specialist in this sort of thing, would probably write a very different definition from the one that I have. And any synonyms that exist and the equivalents would be in our terminological entry. This is all based on a semantic triangle, which is a construct that poses the notion that any given unit of language is based on a thing in the real world, and this thing can be a concrete object like our tree, or it can even be an abstract object which exists in our cultural environment one way or another. The relationship between the thought that we have of this tree, which I've imaged as a bit of transparency, and the real object is represented then in language by some sort of designation. In sign theory, it's a sign. In most cases, it's a term, but it may not be one word. It may maybe be a string of words, or maybe it's a formula or some other symbol. So we have, and when we're looking at the relationship between two languages, we always want to work here at this concept level. We want to make sure that our concepts match as well as they possibly can. Most of the mistranslations you see in the world are the result of people trying to map term to term. An example I often use is the French term contrôler. When the French told the Americans after World War II that they wanted to control a certain environment, the Americans were angry. They said, no, you can't control it. We have to make that decision as a group. It's a democratic decision. And they said, no, that isn't what we mean at all. We mean we want to monitor it. We want to keep track of what is going on there. So simple example of how words that look the same don't have the same meaning. In languages like English and French, or English, French, and Spanish, we have rich resources that we can draw on when we want to document terms. And you'll notice that the noise is beginning to build up behind me. That is the dog snoring. We collect materials on the web, huge resources that if you're very good and you have the right tools, you can collect a specialized corpus that you can then use to extract terms, identify them, create a list, and begin writing your definitions. So much of the terminology mining that we do on the web is a question of smart tools use and the application of very specific methodologies. When we move to just with limited resources, we find that we have a whole other scenario that we have to deal with. We don't have extensive texts we can draw on. Somehow we have to create them. This involves enlisting the speakers of the indigenous language. And this has various and sundry ramifications. They may not really want to work with us. They may be willing, but there are other factors that stand in the way. There may be cultural and human relations issues that we have to deal with very carefully and with a great deal of tact. We probably are going to have to come up with ways to talk with them and record information about aspects of their life. I'm a cook. Let's cook together. Show me how you make those tacos. Show me how you do this. Show me how you do that. Let's go hunting together. Let's go fishing together and record the information so that that can become part of our new corpus. This will, and Kutz drew my attention to this the other day. This process will involve documenting more than we often put in a terminological entry. We need to be documenting morphological issues. We also need to be documenting some semantic and syntactical issues that we don't always think about putting into a terminological resource or maybe even into a lexicographical resource, because there are aspects that we take for granted that are not necessarily to be expected when we encounter totally new languages. So we need to identify our terms, identify our concepts, collect our corpus, however it's going to be structured, We need to evaluate language structures and determine equivalence. And we need to recognize differences, because we're probably going to be coining terms on both sides of the equation. I mentioned the medical situation where maybe we need to communicate with Indigenous peoples, and I've been involved in these projects with medical language that may actually cause problems because of cultural taboos. One of our problems, even here in North America, working with Spanglish speakers, that is a big issue. There are other situations where there will be profound differences that make these coinages a problem or a challenge. This slide comes from my industrial lecture. When we're coining new terms, we can start almost anywhere. Usually we don't start with the term and imagine an object to go with it, but we can have a concept in our minds and try to come up with, actually invent or work with the object associated with that concept, and then we have to give it a name. I'd be willing to bet that most of you don't have a clue what this thing is. I'm an inventor and I've imagined this object and I'm going to produce it. I manufacture it. And but I have to give it a name. And I end up giving it an oxymoron name, a stapleless stapler. A stapleless stapler is a device that enables me to crimp papers in a stack of papers without using a staple. So we come up with the idea of the stapleless stapler. Now, that's not a serious concern of ours here today, but it shows you how coining terms is based on, we've drawn on elements in language that we're familiar with. We know what a stapler is. We know what staples are. And based on our existing knowledge and the concept system that we associate with those objects, we give a new name to a new object. So when we're dealing with Indigenous languages that we're unfamiliar with, we need to know, the first thing we have to do is to collect the existing terms and know something about the relationship among those terms. In some cases, we're dealing with unfamiliar technologies, even looking at their side of things. And we certainly have to familiarize ourselves with the term formation patterns inherent in those languages and the structural discontinuities that exist between our languages. We have to accommodate the needs of the Indigenous community, and we have to be aware of the blind spots that we come to it from our own cultural heritage. Here's an example of a concept coming back into my environment as a speaker of a European language and bearer of a European culture. I don't know whether you can tell what this is. I purposely made him very nebulous. He's a canid, I think. We've been talking about dogs and cats. But what is this thing? He looks ephemeral. I'm going to flash a concept up here, and many of you who know the North American context will know what this guy is. And we have to give him a name in English, and I suspect his name is a direct translation from the Indigenous languages. This is our spirit coyote. He is a creature in the mythology of many of our Native American peoples in North America. He's a wonderful creature. I wish I could tell you more about him, but I don't have time to talk about the spirit coyote. But it gives you an example of, we have to be able to name objects, abstract and real, that occur in the Indigenous community as well, and find a home for them in our concept system. This is not as easy as it looks. Let's look at two languages that many of us know. The English word river is any good-sized body that flows to another good-sized body of water. It doesn't make a difference where the confluence of those bodies of water are. For instance, my Cuyahoga flows. It doesn't fly. It flows into Lake Erie, which is a large freshwater lake. The Missouri River is longer than the Mississippi, but it flows into the Mississippi. The Missouri is a rivière. It flows into a river or a lake. The Mississippi is a fleuve. I can have a very short river in the tidewater of Virginia and the Carolinas. We have many short rivers that flow into the sea. So size isn't the distinguishing factor. The factor is, where is the confluence? Is it with the sea? In Potawatomi, which is one of our languages we're interested in North America, and I don't know how to pronounce this. I wish I had a chance to find out. The language for river is Tsebe or Tsebe. This is not a noun. I mean, we can make the distinction between rivière and fleuve. This is a verb. We think of animate nouns where our dogs and our coyote are animate. We say the dog, he. But this is a verb. A river is not an inanimate object. A river is alive and flowing, and it does things. When we use the word in an utterance in Potawatomi, it has to be conjugated like a verb. It doesn't take noun endings. It's a verb. So we need to be aware of the semantic and syntactic motivation of the different words and terms that we encounter in our environment. And this involves a great deal of careful thought and documentation. And the motivation depends on perspective. I've been working on concept systems and ontologies lately. And you could take the same, our river, we could document in many different ways. We could look at the river as a home for fish, as a place to get in a boat and ride down the river, as a boundary between one geographical area and another. The perspective may vary in terms of language. Our perspective on the coyote varies if we're always keeping in mind the notion of the coyote as a spirit animal. So the concerns are great. And I'm inclined to think that the terminological entry gives us a better chance of documenting all these concerns. I'll show you some examples. Oh, and this slide is, I don't want to forget this one. There may be a missing term in a language. You might think that people living in the Amazon rainforest would have a word for tree. I was reading about one indigenous language in Brazil recently where there are many words that are associated with different kinds of trees. Every kind of tree in the environment has its name and is a known entity as a contributor to the whole environment. But there is no global word for the word tree because trees are so individual and omnipresent. In some languages, there are no words for time as we have it worked out in our major modern languages. And I found this wonderful quote. The source is in the notes on the slides. When a language dies, linguists say the world loses more than just words. What's lost is concepts, thought patterns, history, nuance. Language is a tool that texturizes the world. Without it, the vivid sharpness dulls. A typical terminological entry at core might have a subject field, a definition, terms and equivalents, part of speech for each one of them, a contextual reference, which is a chunk of text that shows us how to use the word, other linguistic information, you might have register, all kinds of things can go in there. You have the option to modify. You can set up your term entry to meet the needs of the language in question. So you can add elements. I feature adding a whole component for morphology when we deal with these kinds of environments. Here's a typical multi-term. Some of you have seen this. Input entry. It's not very helpful actually as a frozen slide because it's an interactive thing. But you'll notice how we have our definition and our other information, administrative information, and then the term information. The terms always are a subset. And this is an example of the user view of a very long entry with many, many synonyms in it. And actually this is a huge entry that also has many different equivalents. I'm just showing Spanish. It has 7 or 8 languages in it. When we want to add new data categories, and by data categories, I mean essentially field names, the place to go is something called DATCAT Info. It's something that Alan Melby and I have been working on for many, many years. It is a compository, a collection of all the data category names that we have been able to find. There's over 3,000. It's the result of decades of work, both on the part of ISO TC37 and a number of funded projects. Europeans will be familiar with CLARIN. There's a Linguistic Linked Open Data group that are defining concepts for use in web environments and on the semantic web. When we decide that we want to document certain kinds of linguistic elements, we want to turn to the data category registry to find the elements that we want to, so that we use the data category name or map the data category name that we need in order to ensure that anything that we create will be interoperable and interchangeable with other resources. And with that, I'm going to stop. Some of you may have missed the fact that I mentioned that these slides are culled out of a huge deck that I used for a 3-hour lecture with my students. So I'm just hitting highlights here.